It's funny you was talking about boys town.
Part. All right, so we're going to pick up where we left off, talking about connectives. So again, I will, and in the speech outline template, refer to these as transitions or transition statements. The text, as well as others, have renamed them over time and gone even deeper into different types of connectives, in which case transition statements are just one of the multiple types of connectives. But I want to share with you some examples of how we connect main points. That's essentially the goal of a connective, is it's a word or a phrase that helps us connect our ideas as we go throughout our speech. And again, I'll refer to these as transitions. And in the speech outline template, you'll see italicized. After each main point, you'd have your subpoints or supporting points, and then you have this line that's italicized that says transitions. That is that connective that is connecting your main points. So there are, I guess we could kind of divide connectives into four types. I just want to give you some examples, and when we start practicing and doing our own examples here, this will probably make more sense. And you'll start to see or kind of hear what I'm expecting as we go through this. So the first would be what we call a transition statement, where you say something to the effect of, now that I've shared this, next I will share that. It is a way to indicate, right, that you are finished with one thought and moving to the next thought. Here's an example. I have spoken so far of Cesar Chavez, the community organizer, but it was his work as a labor leader that truly etched his name into American history. This is an example of, if my first main point was an informative speech about Cesar Chavez, community organizer, right? That is my first main point. My next main point is him as a labor leader, right? This is a way to help your speech flow from point to point. And that is the purpose of a transition statement. And so without transition statements, speeches are choppy. And so, as a matter of fact, that's usually the feedback I give after informative speeches is, if it feels choppy, then we need to spend a little more time developing our transition statements. Another way to do it would be what's called an internal preview, where you say, first, we've looked at this, second, we will look at that, or, second, we looked at this, third, we will look at that. So using kind of that internal guide. We also call these signposts. So the first cause, the second cause, the final cause, right? These are phrases that we can use to help guide our audience through our speech. Again, our speech for our audience is not necessarily a surprise, right? We want them to hear the same thing multiple times. We preview it and then we review it, right? And we do that in our introduction and in our conclusion. But also our transition statements are repeating, are what we call a redundant touchstone. It's redundancy that's built into our speech so that we are repeating our main points in an effort to ensure that if our audience doesn't remember anything else, they at least remember our main points. And again, as we do some examples, you'll start to see at least some of the transitions that I use that you can adopt as you are working on your speeches. So let's talk about speaking to inform, which essentially is to teach. And that is the objective. The primary objective with our first formal speech is you all are teaching us something. Something hopefully you have some knowledge of, some experience with, you do some research on it, and you come to class, bring that to class, and teach us about it. In fact, I have, and I know other instructors, kind of design some of their lectures as an informative speech. Lectures are a little bit different because we have many more main points in a lecture than we would in a speech, but they are theoretically similar. And so ultimately, the goal is to design a message that conveys knowledge or understanding. So remember, our special occasion speech, the purpose was to meet the needs of the occasion, and you determine what that was, right? To entertain, to commemorate, to introduce. For an informative speech, the goal is not necessarily to fulfill the needs of the occasion, because we know really what that is, and that is to inform, to educate, to pass on knowledge. It's also, if we were to invoke Aristotle, we would say that even though we are providing information, there are persuasive elements. But I would say that as we are designing our informative speeches, be very careful not to lean persuasive. And I share that because when we get to persuasive speaking, we're really going to dive into logos, ethos, and pathos, how we use that to persuade. And so we don't want to do that necessarily here. But again, according to Aristotle, all public speaking is persuasive. But we, in this particular course, really want to develop our teaching chops, right? We would say we want to develop our ability to teach, to inform. And so, so that is the goal of this speech. So we're going to talk about, if you have the speech outline template in front of you, and Shukri, if I could just use this. So if you have the speech outline template example, what we're covering is going to be the preparation stage. So you're going to see that there's a type and organizational pattern listed there. We're also going to cover, thank you, we're also going to cover the different organizational patterns. So this is essentially the first choices, the first decisions you have to make, is you have to determine the speech type. So in no particular order, we're going to talk about informative speech types. So what's the type? We're going to talk about informative speech, let's see, what was the second one? Types, and then we're going to go into methods. There we go. Types and methods. There we go, because we've already covered or patterns, right? So methods. And then organizational patterns. These are the three choices we have to make before we can go out and do some research. So I share this because originally, I didn't have the preparation stage as part of the outline template. And it wasn't until I started teaching it and students started saying, I don't know where to start. I don't know how what direction to go and how to begin. And so that's when I incorporated the preparation stage into my lecture and onto the outline. Not that it wasn't necessarily part of the outline that I had used, but the goal is to get you a roadmap, to figure out your path from where you are here to delivering that speech. And so it's going to require making some choices. What type of speech are you giving? What methods are you using to inform? And then in what order are you going to share your main points, or the organizational pattern? So let's talk about these four informative speech types, because the speech you do should fall into one of these categories. And again, the reason you make this choice up front is so that you know what kind of information to go out and collect, right? Are you collecting information about an object, a process, an event, or concept? Because based on this decision, you're going to be collecting a little bit different information. So let's take a look at objects. So what is an informative speech about an object? An object is anything visible, tangible, or stable in form. So anything as an object that isn't necessarily going to transform or change or shift. So objects could be places. Some places could be considered object. A lot of things are considered objects. For the purposes of an informative speech, the people also could be considered objects, right? For example, Barack Obama as a person is probably not going to change much, right? We know what he looks like, we know what he sounds like, right? We know his history, we know his background, right? So as an object, there's a lot of information we can go out and collect. And so, again, while it sounds weird, right, to say people are objects, right? I said for the purposes of our speech, they are pretty stable in form. Let me give you some examples of some informative speeches that some students have done. And they may seem simplistic, but we're not looking to be very, very complicated in this particular speech. So it can be simple. And when I share these with you, I'll also share with you some other insights we can get just from seeing the title. Just from seeing the title of a speech, we can kind of glean some additional information about what that speech will be about. So here's my first example. So my first example would be a speech about the past, present, and future of Ford cars. So my subject is Ford cars. The type, cars, Ford cars, as a thing, are pretty stable in form, right? I can look to it and say, that's a Ford car, that's a Ford car, that's a Ford car, right? Most likely the emblem, right, is kind of what gives it away. So the past, present, and future, we already talked through organizational patterns. And I want to point out that if you are interested in doing some kind of chronological organizational pattern, this is a good phrase to use. The past, present, and future of whatever your subject is. When I hear that, I know your main points are going to be past, present, future, right? So I know that your main points are chronological. So that's just an example I want to provide. We learned about the spatial organizational pattern, right? Where you can go inside out, outside in, up, down, top, bottom. So this is an example, right? The Statue of Liberty from top to bottom, where the speaker is presenting information, right, about each of these segments, right? And you could also do bottom to top if you wanted. You could do inside out. So that is an example of an object that will be shared with us using the spatial organizational pattern. The evolution of bicycles, right? So bicycles, and you could get even more specific. You could talk about a specific type of bicycle. You could talk about a particular brand of bicycle if you wanted. So you could narrow this down if you wanted. But the general subject is bicycles. And when I see that word evolution, that also kind of clues me into the fact that you're going to be talking about something chronologically, perhaps. Something that is changing over time. And so, but that's an example. An object pretty stable in form. Bicycles have some key elements, right? Usually they have pedals, wheels, handlebars, or seat. I guess seat, handlebars, pedals are kind of and wheels are kind of the core parts of a bicycle. So now let's talk about the second type, and that's going to be a process. So this is going to be any kind of systematic series of actions leading to a specific result. So it's anything that the audience can replicate and duplicate once they leave this room. So you're teaching us to do something. The systematic series of actions leading to a specific result or outcome. So you might want to do a process speech. Here's an example. I did have a student deliver a really creative speech. It was titled 5 Steps to Creating a No-Sew Fleece Blanket. And she took us through these 5 steps, right? Step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, step 5. And by the time you get to the end, the audience, if they replicate those steps, should be able to produce a no-sew fleece blanket. If you're familiar, you cut and you tie and essentially put the fleece together, and then she would donate them to children's hospitals. And so when she delivered this, or when she was preparing to deliver this, she was finding that if she just went through the 5 steps, she wasn't reaching the minimum time. And so I want to take a moment just to share that if you find yourself in that position, for example, with the process speech, if you're taking us through the process, you're like, well, it's a 3 to 5 minute speech and I'm at 2 minutes and 30 seconds. You need to add some material. You need to include some things. And so the question came up, if it's a process and I'm teaching you the process and that's not long enough, what do I include? And I would say for a process, you could also provide some background context, right? Why did she produce the no-sew fleece blankets? She's teaching us how to produce the no-sew fleece blankets, but maybe share with us a story or two related to maybe an experience she has had, or like I said, going deeper into why she does this and who she gives it to. So that's an example of a process. How to tie a tie in 3 steps. So this would be, again, taking us through that process. But again, it may not be long enough. So for this particular assignment, you may want to add some more material, right? Maybe teaching us a little bit more about different types of ties or how ties have changed over time. You can add those pieces in, but the primary objective is to teach us this process. Step 1, step 2, step 3. How to make a pizza from scratch. So if you're teaching us that process, I had a student do this. They worked at Pizza Hut, and when they came in, they had really strong ethos, really strong credibility. They wore their Pizza Hut apron and their little Pizza Hut hat, and so visually they had really strong credibility. They knew what they were talking about because they worked at Pizza Hut. Well, at least we hoped they knew, right? So for this particular speech, they taught us this process. And took us through those steps. Now, I could approach pizza as the subject as an object, right? If I wanted to talk about maybe the past, present, and future of pizza, how pizza has changed over time. The subject is the same, but I'm treating it differently. I'm treating it as an object. So you'll start to see that any particular subject, we can go a variety of different directions. And that's why it's helpful for you to make a choice up front as to which direction do you want to go. Do you want to talk about pizza as far as a process making it, or maybe an object, or maybe you want to talk about an event, which we'll get to next, which maybe there's National Pizza Day, and you can talk to us about pizza as an event. So again, a variety of directions you can go. It's up to you to decide which direction you want to go. I did have a student teach us how to change a car tire. And they brought in some cool visual aids, but they also, through their PowerPoint, took us through visually the steps of how to change a car tire. So all those are processes. So if you're interested in teaching us a process, there's some examples. The next would be an event. So this is anything that has happened or is regarded as happening, anything that might happen in the future. Events can be fun, particularly holidays tend to be pretty common events that people do speeches about. So let me give you some examples of just some events. So the first is going to be the history of St. Patrick's Day. So again, just using the word history, I know that chances are your organizational pattern is probably going to be chronological, right? If you're taking me through the history of it. It could also be a topical organizational pattern, right? Just kind of any three topics underneath this subject of St. Patrick's Day. But that's an example of an event. This is another holiday, so Ramadan and its practices, fasting, prayer, and charity. So again, I'm treating this as an event. I could also, again, go through the processes, right? How do you do these things? If I wanted to do it as a process speech. Here, I am sharing with you 3 points, three things related to this topic. And so I am essentially doing a topical organizational pattern, right? And I can just see that from the title, right? I'm providing you three general topics related to the subject of Ramadan. I could also talk about the past, present, and future, right? Or the history of, and I could treat this as, go a little bit different direction and use a chronological organizational pattern. Maybe I could talk about how Ramadan is celebrated in different parts of the world, and I could do a spatial organizational pattern to talk about these things. So again, it's for you to kind of mix and match what you think works best. And that's kind of the task before us as we start thinking about what you want to do your informative speech on, is what do you want to mix and match. The last of our speech types are going to be concept. So if it doesn't fall into any of the other categories, chances are it's a concept. Concept is very broad. It covers beliefs, theories, ideas, notions, principles, things that are a little more obscure, probably, things that, again, if they're not an object, a process, or an event, chances are they are a concept. And again, that helps you to determine that so you know what kind of information you need to collect. Probably the clearest, or kind of simply put, is a concept is an idea, right? Something that isn't necessarily visible or tangible or stable in form. It might not necessarily, it may be something that has changed over time. Let me give you some examples. If I was going to teach you the basics of informative speaking, that's an example, right? It doesn't necessarily fall into an object, process, or an event. I could treat it as an object, and maybe there's a specific speech that I want to teach you about. Maybe I want to teach you about 3 strategies used in Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech, right? I'm still maybe talking about informative speaking, but doing it through a specific object, a specific speech. I could talk to you about 3 steps in writing a speech, right? So then I'm teaching you these steps in this process. But if I'm just covering kind of the basic general concepts related to informative speaking, it would be a concept speech. The science of cooking is another example. So this here is general, it's broad. It's not cooking something specific. We're not looking necessarily at a specific object, but if we are talking about pairing, elements with heat to produce something delicious, right? And we're talking through the science of that. That's more general, right? More of a concept, an idea, a theory, right? So anything scientific probably falls into this category. I'll give you some other examples. And instead of, and I present these a little bit differently because I'm showing you the specific purpose, the central idea, which I think I actually took the central idea possibly. Is that part of that speech outline that you have? Is it just the central idea? No, okay. I believe I took it out because it's somewhat redundant from my point of view. So, specific purpose, to inform my audience about the geographical regions of the Mississippi River. So if I want to teach you about this object, right, the Mississippi River is pretty stable in form as the river itself, right? I mean, yes, it may change over time, but as a thing, it's pretty stable in form. It's not necessarily going to change its name. We know where it's located. So if I wanted to talk to you about three parts of this object, that is the Mississippi River, I could break that down into upper, middle, and lower. So here are my three main points, and then just a subpoint, right, that provides a little more insight. The subpoints, again, I could go deeper into this, right? So the subpoints are where I'm providing my research, right? My quotes, my statistics, my stories. So I may have multiple main points related to the upper part of the Mississippi River. Then I'll transition to the middle part of the Mississippi River, known for its wildlife refuges and the fishing opportunities. And then the lower Mississippi River, so known for its river traffic and connection into the Gulf of Gulf of Mexico. And so the object, so I'm treating the Mississippi River as an object and sharing with you spatially, right, upper, middle, and lower. Spatially, or we could say geographically. That's the order of my main points. So I'm hoping you're starting to see, right, that this is my speech type. It's about an object, and you can start to see how I'm using a variety of organizational patterns to convey this information. Here's another example. To inform my audience of the common methods used by stage magicians to perform their tricks. So stage musicians may use either mechanical devices, or they may use sleight of hand. And so if I'm wanting to inform you about how to do this, and by the end of my speech you know how to do either or both of these things, that would be a good process speech. So for example, magic using mechanical devices could be my first main point. My second main point, magic using sleight of hand. And again, I go deeper in my main points into each of those. And the goal is, by the end of my speech, for my audience to know how to do this. I could probably do a whole informative speech just on, using mechanical devices and doing magic tricks, or just doing magic tricks using sleight of hand. So again, it's up to you to decide how narrow you want to go. But yeah, so that's an example of a process. An event, to inform my audience of Japan's Obon Festival, right? So this is an event that happens. It happens annually. It's been happening for a while. And so here's an example, right? So I'm going to share with you three topics related to this event. So paper, lanterns, dances, and graveside gatherings are my three main points. And I'm, again, teaching you about an event. Here's an example of a concept speech. So to inform my audience about the basic principles of nonviolent resistance. So nonviolent resistance is a concept, an idea, a theory. And so here's an example. So here are three parts of nonviolent resistance. Moral means, not harming our enemies, and suffering. And so I'm teaching you, again, these three concepts. I'm doing so topically, right? These don't necessarily fall. I'm not doing it spatially. I'm not doing it chronologically. I'm not doing a comparison. So that's why it's topical. Topical is the broadest of the organizational patterns. So that is an example of a concept. So those are our speech types. So now we're going to transition to the last part we need to know, or the last choice we need to make when we are preparing to do an informative speech. And that's going to be our informative speech methods. You can think of this as the tools that you are using to inform your audience. And this is probably the most important choice to make because this is the information you're going out and collecting. You're going out and collecting definitions. You're going out and collecting descriptions. You're going out and collecting explanations. You're going out and collecting words and phrases that demonstrate for us how to do something. So I've provided, you may hear me refer to these as a informative speech of definition or to define, or an informative speech of description. So I've provided kind of both words there. And I'm going to talk about each of them because a couple of them can get confusing because the terms in society are very similar, but again, how we utilize them or how we go about doing a definition speech versus a description versus an explanation are different. So let me teach you the language and what the language means for the purposes of an informative speech. So let's start with a speech of definition. This is going to be where you provide synonyms, meaning, background, just think historical context. If you're diving into the history of something, the background of something, that's going to be an informative speech of definition. You're providing to us definitions. So the information you're collecting is going to be a lot of defining of terms. And I'll give you an example of this, of an informative speech of definition, where we'll hear someone defining for us terms. The next is going to be an informative speech or description speech, or an informative speech where we are describing. Now we have a benefit with doing speeches of description because you have a PowerPoint that you'll be using. So you can actually visually show us what you want us to see, but the information you are collecting describes for us details. And so you can think about if we did not have a visual aid up here, the type of information you're collecting is going to be how things look, how things sound, how things feel. A good example are word pictures, words that help us see something or see pictures in our mind. So again, you have the benefit of having visual aid, but again, the information you're collecting is going to be characteristics of something, features of something. And again, I'll give you an example of that in a moment. The third type is going to be an informative speech of explanation, or to explain to us how or why of your subject. So this is why it's not necessarily definition. Definition, you're going out and collecting synonyms, collecting definitions. Here, your main points will be how something is done, or why something is the way it is. So you could talk about the current state of something, or how something operates, how something works, how something functions, or why something functions the way it does. So that is an informative speech of explanation, or to explain to us. So again, that is the information you're collecting, is how and why. And again, in your main points, you'll use those words. And so I'll be able to hear when you are giving your speech, I'll be able to hear these words, how or why, and I'll know that it's an informative speech of explanation. And then the last one is actually pretty fun. At least students have shared. It's kind of the most fun of them, is where you demonstrate for us how to do something. So you provide a chronological procedure or process of how to accomplish something. So the no-sew fleece blanket, right? She talks through that. Chances are, if you're doing a process speech, chances are you are going to be demonstrating for us how to do something. So those often go together, but they don't necessarily have to. Not every demonstration speech may be about a process, right? You could be demonstrating other things for us, but essentially you are wanting to talk us through a chronological procedure of how to complete something. So let's, I'll kind of dive into kind of my guidelines, some recommendations I have when we're thinking about our informative speeches, and then we're going to watch, I have some examples of some of these as well. And the examples will help us kind of, just in the short example, we'll be able to identify some of these things, the type, the methods, the organizational pattern. So let's start with this first kind of guideline. explain, so not to, actually I should probably remove that word since we just talked about it for speeches of explanation. Really what we're wanting to do is we don't want to under or overestimate what the audience knows. We want to make sure we're providing detail to our audience. We should assume that our audience maybe doesn't know some of the foundational pieces of our subject, and so we may have to go back to the foundation, go back to the start of our subject, and provide that information. Let's watch an example. So in this example, you'll be able to you'll know what her subject is. You'll also be able to identify the type of speech. You'll also be able to identify her method and her org pattern just from this short clip. So let's listen and then we'll kind of dissect it.
Based on the teachings of the ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius, Confucianism is a code of conduct for life. It's a blend of ethical, moral, political, and philosophical insight. One key to understanding Confucianism is the word Gen, J-E-N. While there are many different ways to translate Gen, it's basically about living compassionately in society. According to the Encyclopedia of Social History, Gen means being sincere to oneself and sharing the feelings of others by putting oneself in the position of others. Now that we have a better understanding of the word Gen, let's take a look at some other aspects of Confucianism.
So for this, we can tell what her subject is, right? The subject is about, and I'm not going to spell the entire word, but it's about Confucianism, right? And we know that she's talking through some main points about Confucianism. The first one is Gen, right, and what that is. And she gives us the definition, right? So we know just from that short clip, we know her subject, Confucianism. We know that she's defining for us elements of Confucianism, and we know that if she's just giving us these topics related to the subject, that her organizational pattern is topical, right? So it's just 3 topics related to this subject. So just from that short clip, we can identify. And I share that because the goal, right, is for you, if you've made these choices in advance, right, you know your subject, you know your org pattern, right, you know what kind of information you're sharing with us, you know, you're able to go out and collect some good information that gives you a path, that gives you a direction to go to write your informative speech. So with that, we'll take about a 3-minute break. So it is currently 6:10. At 6:13, we'll come back together. If you need to stretch your legs, grab some water, and we'll pick up with our next topic. Nice back. All right, so that's explaining concepts. The next is relating our subject to our audience. So this is also, we've talked about finding common ground and building rapport. We do that not just in the introduction, but we want to do that throughout the speech and really make sure our audience can relate to our subject. Let me show you an example of a student doing that.
Yeah. Your body can't go any further. Your toenails fell off long ago. Your lungs are on fire. Your heart is 1 beat away from exploding. Are you dying? Are you having a nightmare? Neither. You're about to cross the finish line of your first Ironman competition. Nothing could feel better.
Your, right? Some of you kind of perked up when it's like, your toenails fell off long ago. Like, wait, what? Are you dying? Wait, I'm not. What's going on here? Right? Make it personal for your audience. Use that. Incorporate your audience into your stories, into your examples. Use the power of you in your speech, that word you, in order to help your audience feel a connection to, or at least drawn into, your speech. My other tip, other guideline is not to be too technical. I've had some students, especially some like pre-med science students, that just love talking about like biology and cells and all of that stuff. and can get very technical. And while that stuff is very cool, again, we want to keep it somewhat simple for our audience, our general audience. And so we don't want to get too technical into the minutiae, the details of things that are too complicated. So we're not looking for you to teach us the process of osmosis or whatever, right? So we're looking for something a little broader, but something that you have a connection to, something you have some experience with. And if that's the process of osmosis, so be it. Yeah.
But would you say like it's also dependent on like the event itself? Because let's say that you were like at some sort of science conference, like wouldn't that be like more like I guess appropriate in that?
Definitely.
Any science innuendos or something?
Exactly. So I'll give you, that's a great example. So I do conference presentations and for the research I've done. And my first time in Chicago was presenting at the National Communication Association. And I was presenting a paper that looked at, it was called, again, this is going to be too technical for a general speech, but framing the discourse of leadership. Leadership language in higher education, business, and communication studies, right? So for that context, for that environment, I was around communication teachers, educators, researchers, right? People that worked as speech writers for presidents and people who do research on communication in different contexts. That would be a great environment for that speech, but probably not one I would necessarily do here, right? So that's a good example. It is context specific. So if you are doing an academic or a research speech, you will want to get technical. So yeah, thank you, Nancy. So the other is avoiding abstractions. So we also don't want to be too general, too vague. And so again, give thought to what are you wanting to teach us, and make sure you are providing us enough details to be able to do that or understand that. On here, similar to relating to our subject, relating our subject to our audience, is the concept of personalizing ideas. And I'll play this video and then talk through it.
Lydia. She was the new girl in school. We were in a couple of the same classes. Sometimes we sat together at lunch, and we would see each other during recess. Lydia was kind, funny, and supportive. But for 6 months, I didn't know the secret she was hiding. Lydia didn't like to talk about her family, and she never wanted me to meet her mom. And she never invited me over to her house. She always insisted we meet somewhere like the mall. Then one day, I found out why. Lydia never invited me to her house because she did not have a house. For more than a year, she, her mother, and her little brother had been homeless. They had been living in shelters, staying with relatives, and resting their heads wherever they could. We've seen how family homelessness affects millions of Americans and can lead to poor physical and mental health, episodes of violence, and a range of developmental difficulties. Homelessness is not just the disheveled man sitting by himself on the street, the image that we've seen countless times in the media. Homelessness affects families. It affects people like Lydia. Or I should say, it used to affect Lydia. After 2 difficult years, her mother found a job that paid her enough to rent an apartment. Lydia herself now works part-time and takes classes at a community college. She made it through the stressful time that affects far too many families, and she remains my friend.
So here you have so personalize your speech by sharing your personal stories, right? And see if there are people in kind of your sphere of influence, your people who you interact with on a regular basis who maybe have stories they're willing to share with you that you could then incorporate. You can always change names, dates, locations, right, to protect their identity. But those stories and those personal stories really do enhance your speech. So that's an example of this student used a personal story at some point, maybe in their introduction or during their speech, and then at the end of their speech they came back and concluded that story, gave us the outcome of that story. And that's a skillful technique that we'll see in some other examples as we go throughout the course. So personalizing and giving personal stories. And then kind of my last tip, last guideline recommendation is about being creative in the language that you use, being creative in how you present your information. And we're going to dive into delivery techniques in a few weeks. We'll also dive into visual aids and using visual aids. But just want to kind of put that kind of thought in your mind about how can you be creative in conveying information. So here's an example.
As represented in this slide, there's an iron skeleton underneath the copper skin. Darcy Grigsby, author of the 2012 book Colossal, explains that the skeleton is made of a 92-foot tall pylon that is stuck deep in the stone pedestal. The skeleton has flat metal bars that connect the copper skin to the pylon. These bars work like springs. They provide the strength and flexibility that allow the Statue of Liberty to survive the harsh weather of New York Harbor.
So here you can hear some powerful language, right? It goes deep, harsh, right? We're using some language creatively. He's also using his PowerPoint creatively, his visual aid, and he has added animations into his visual aid to kind of guide the audience visually through what he is sharing with us. And so, again, we'll get into using our PowerPoints, but I wanted to kind of put that in your mind so you can start thinking about, I don't necessarily teach PowerPoint in this course, but you can always go back and watch the tutorial through the Check Your Tech assignment. You can watch the PowerPoint tutorial and then through YouTube, right, find other examples of how to do animations or how to do transitions for your PowerPoint so that it is visually creative. So I like to share this quote: if you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But whatever you do, you have to keep moving forward. And I think that's kind of my message with informative speeches. You have to start somewhere. So do what you can to just pick a subject, right? So that you can keep moving forward. Once you pick a subject, then you move forward with identifying the type, methods, and org pattern, right, to help you move forward. Once you do that, you can then start doing research and collecting information to help you move forward. If at any point you hit a roadblock, you're like, this isn't really working, you can make changes, right? You can change the direction you're going with the type of speech it is, with the methods you're using to inform us, with how you are presenting your main points to us. So you can make those choices and those changes as you go so that you keep moving forward. One of the challenges that I see from students is just making that initial choice, right? Deciding what that subject is. And I have some students that maybe they do a draft of their speech and they don't really dig it. They don't really like it. And I'm like, Professor, can I just start over and change my subject? You sure can, yes. Matter of fact, as someone that does this and teaches this, I've written a ton of drafts that I've never used. And that's okay. Just going through the process of writing a draft outline will help you develop that skill. So even if you don't end up using it, you've still moved forward, as Dr. King encourages us to do. The next thing I want to touch on is I want to dive a little deeper into doing research. And so as we know, Abraham Lincoln once said, "Don't believe everything you read on the internet." He's famous for this, right? Isn't he? Right? Are you familiar with this quote? Yeah, right? Don't believe everything you read on the internet. He was ahead of his time, right? He was a prophet, right? Yeah. So we know, right? This is not accurate. This is not real. This is not true. But you'll be amazed that just when you go to Google, right, just the things that pop up. And again, with artificial intelligence and the changes we're seeing with that, what we find on the internet, we have to scrutinize, right? We have to be critical of. And so because we can't trust everything that we find on the internet, we need to be critical thinkers and discern and go through and figure out, is this accurate information? I want to give you some guidance on how to do that. And we've already kind of talked a little bit about that in the news and how to do that through news sources. But I'm going to share with you some resources that you can utilize, some trusted places you can go to get this information. That's not Google, all right? So we're going to avoid Wikipedia, we're going to avoid Google, and we're going to stick to primary sources, news sources, and I'm going to show you where you can go and how you can collect this information. First and foremost is the library. I know as our society has advanced and a lot of things are available online, maybe going to the library is seen as old school, but I'll tell you, libraries have a lot of resources, and as I have done my research throughout my academic career, and as I continue to do research for my doctoral program, I have found locating a spot in a library to spend a Saturday or to spend my day off doing research is super helpful and beneficial. Matter of fact, I was just talking with my spouse about the fact that this weekend I need to carve out some time to do some research. I met with my academic advisor for my program last night, and I've got a stack of books that I need to read in order to move forward with some of the research that I'm doing. And I've not been able to get to it at home. There's too many distractions. And so I told my spouse, I was like, look, you can go out and party Friday night if you want, but I'm going to bed early because I got to get up Saturday and find a spot in a library or at a coffee shop and dive into some research. I shared these images. This is where I went to graduate school to get my master's at the University of Alabama. This is our library. And then to the right is the building where all my classes were for my program. I think the architecture is beautiful. But both the main library and where all my classes were, both locations had communication libraries. And so for all the research I was doing in communication, I found that particularly helpful. So I just share those because you may have to seek out and find your spot, right, where you can go. I recently signed up for membership at the Newberry Library. Has anybody heard of the Newberry Library? It's a private library in Chicago. It didn't cost me anything to join, but I went and got a library card, and it's closer to downtown. It's kind of on the north side, and they have special collections that they're known for. But yeah, because I was like, that's a good spot. That for example, if I wanted to spend a Friday night or spend some time after work where I don't necessarily want to go home, but I want to go to a spot. I got Harold Washington Library downtown, but I also now have the Newberry Library where I can go. It's a beautiful spot. And so, yeah, I think if you're looking it up, it's it's a beautiful spot. And again, find your spot to do your research. Let me share with you some recommendations for gathering data and preparing your supporting points. So far, we've talked about types, methods, and organizational patterns. Again, the organizational pattern is how you're ordering your main points. Now we're diving into what are you doing after you share with us that main point, right? What are the supporting points that you are including? So I'm going to share with you some research resources, my research tips, and then just some reminders about citations, which we've kind of already talked about. So my first resource, as I mentioned, is the library. And at the library, more so than what they may have physically there, the librarians are an amazing resource. Because librarians, you may or may not realize this, many librarians go to school to be a librarian. I have a cousin who went to, so in my family, there's, on the paternal side of my family, there's only 2 of us that have a college education. I'm one of about 18 grandkids, so I'm kind of on that side of the family. We're all around the same age. And only myself and my cousin Nicole have a college degree, and her degree is in library sciences. And she lives in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and she and her partner are both actually librarians. One at a K through 12 school, and then she is at the library in Baton Rouge. And so she loves it. She tells me that why she wanted to be a librarian was because people come to her with a question, and she gets to be a detective and go out and help them find that information. So I encourage you to, wherever you go for a library, talk to the librarian that's there, because chances are if they like their job, right, and they want to be a librarian, they want to help you. They want to help you find those resources, help you, direct you to where you can get the information you need. So I encourage you, check in with the local librarian, introduce yourself to them. There are even some places have specialized librarians. So for example, for my doctoral program, there is someone assigned to the doctoral program for leadership studies. So all he does is when we have questions about research, where to go to find particular research, we call Daniel. And Daniel is the one that we go to for that. So but he's a librarian, but his specialization is all things leadership research. So librarians are super helpful. What libraries have that you can't just get off of Google are going to be primary sources like encyclopedias and catalogs. There are different types of yearbooks. I don't mean like yearbooks like, you know, high school yearbooks, right? I mean like there are books that catalog and record what have happened for a particular year. If you're doing some kind of science-related presentation, there might be yearbooks related to agriculture that tell you kind of agricultural patterns that have happened in the past. Quotation books. I know we can find quotations online, but if it's been published in a book, it's been vetted, it's been verified. And so libraries where I would recommend finding a good quote book. Biographies, so if you are going to do an informative speech about a person, then I would encourage you to consult a primary text being a biography of that person. I love biographies. I love reading biographies. I learned so much about people through that. But again, you don't have to read the entire book to use it as a source. But I encourage you, if you're talking about a person, make sure you've at least consulted one biography of that person. You can find newspapers and periodicals, so magazines, and I'll share with you how you can also find that on databases. But a lot of libraries may have the hard copy, or they may have on film or recorded electronically or digitally newspaper articles that you could, again, primary sources that you can use. And then databases, academic databases. And I'll share with you next week, I will share with you, I'll kind of take you through the City College's website and where to go to the library, where to go to look at academic databases, and how to set up some search parameters to help you be able to hone in on and narrow in on a particular subject. So that's why it'll be helpful, by the end of this week to have a subject in mind, because when I do that activity in class, I ask for what's the subject, and so that's why I'm going to wait and do that next week. Internet, the wide world of the internet. There's a lot of things there. Here's some things to make note of. Government websites, anything that ends in .gov, .gov, is an official website that should be trusted. Information that's published on government websites have been vetted and verified, and if there is a mistake, they are obligated and required to post that a mistake was made. But chances are there are very little mistakes, because there's a lot of rounds of vetting and verification that's done before stuff's published publicly on the website. So if you are trying to find information about a particular city, about a particular location, again, particularly here in the United States, those are going to be .gov. If you're looking at educational institutions, any website that ends in .edu is going to be a credible source. There's a lot of different information. I mean, a lot of people are like, well, I'm not talking about a university. Why would I go to a college or whatever? Why would I go to a .edu? A lot of colleges and universities publish publicly on their sites information. I'll give you an example. One of the first presentations that I did academically was at a research symposium at the University of Tennessee. I was presenting on some research I had done developing a concept called nonverbal immediacy. And when I presented at that conference, my abstract...
Yeah, it's like a really bad storm right now.
I saw the clouds coming in, yeah.
It's
So
95% coverage.
okay, so big storm coming in, okay. Good to know. So I know I saw the clouds earlier, but it looked pretty bad. So .edu. So the abstract that I wrote, or the paper that I had to write for the research symposium, was published publicly on the University of Tennessee's website. So if anyone wants to do an informative speech about nonverbal immediacy, you can go and find that paper. Something I'm excited about that other people may not be. But anyway, that is information, right? Information published publicly on a .edu website. And so again, you can find, there's also a lot of colleges and universities have different think tanks, different organizations that are a part of that institution. At the University of Alabama, we had a business think tank office. Essentially, they helped small businesses grow and develop, and so they had a lot of resources related to business development and starting your own business. That was published on a .edu website. So then you've got .orgs, and I want to put a little disclaimer with .orgs, because while some of them are credible, some of them may not be. There have been kind of a loosening of restrictions on .org websites. So just because it's a .org doesn't automatically make it credible, But I would say it makes it credible if it meets some of the other requirements that we're going to talk about in a moment. Yeah.
In what way have they like loosened the restrictions on what can be a .org?
Yeah, so for example, I have a website, tjmartin.org. All I had to do was sign up for it. So you don't have to verify yourself as an organization in order to create and own and operate a .org website. Yeah, you used to. Same thing with .com. Now websites don't even have to end in .com, so they've loosened those requirements as well.
Do you think that's gonna perpetuate this idea of like fake news and whatnot?
It could, yeah, definitely. Yeah, it makes a and thankfully we can still trust these, but it makes it a little more confusing, right? We have to dive a little deeper into the credibility of an organization, to their if it's an organization, what's their expertise? Who do they have working for them? So we have to do a little more digging than we used to for organizations. Yeah. So then there's Wikipedia and Google, which only use it as a starting point, right? So it's good if you know nothing about a topic and you just want to find out some general information, but at no point will we ever cite or reference Google or Wikipedia. So how do we evaluate, and I put evaluating documents, I should probably change this, because this is just evaluating credibility of our sources. And this is kind of, I know we talked a little bit about this with news, but I want to kind of dive deeper because when you're going like to a website or reviewing a source, we should ask ourselves these 3 questions. Who is the author? What are their credentials? What is their training? That's what I mean by credentials. I know I had a student previously asked, what does the word credentials mean? What's their training? What's their expertise? What's their background? So if they're a journalist, they should have a background and training as a journalist. If they're a politician, they might have a background and training, mostly, it seems like, as a lawyer or a business owner, right? Which you can evaluate whether that's credible or not, up to you. So, but we want to say, who is the author? What are their credentials? What's their expertise? Some people publish things of which they have no knowledge. And so that is what we're trying to kind of weed out. Sponsorship. Who sponsored or provided the funding for the particular research or for the particular article that's being done? Recognizing that, particularly in news, there's bias, right? And so we need to look to say, who sponsored this article, right? If a politician was the one behind the organization that published an article, chances are that article is going to be biased towards that, politician. And so we need to be mindful of that. We need to recognize that. So who sponsored this? Who provided the funding for this? There's a lot of organizations that are sponsored by grants, either government or foundation grants. That's where it can get a little muddy, right? Because if it's a foundation, some foundations serve particular causes and really good causes. Some foundations serve a particular biased goal. And so that's where we need to do our research and our due diligence to determine that organization's credibility. And then the last thing we need to ask ourselves is, how recent is this? So it's important to understand that research, at least when we dive into looking at databases and where to go to get research articles, how recent is it? Now it's important to know that it takes time to do research and to publish that research. I'll give you an example. There was research that I did in 2012, 2013, and 2014. Did not get published until 2017. Now, was that considered relevant research? Yes. But because the process of doing the research and then peer reviewing the research and then getting an organization like a journal to publish it takes time. I presented that research at conferences and got feedback from scholars. That takes time. So the process of doing research, academic research, scholarly research, takes time. So keep that in mind. That something that's published, the research may have been over the course of several years. That doesn't eliminate it. That doesn't make it not relevant. But we want to make sure that what we are referencing is the most recent. Because I haven't looked to see, but the research that I published, someone may have done a different study or updated my study. And so there might be some new information, some new insights relating to that research. And I'll kind of explain the process. So when we are doing scholarly research, we start off with an idea or a research question. And we usually are maybe If we're in an environment like an academic institution, or bouncing that idea, that research question off of advisors and professors. And then once we do kind of determine a plan of how we want to go about doing research, we have to have that approved by what's called an institutional review board. So that is a panel of scholars who say, yes, you can move forward and do this research. Really, what they're trying to do is determine, does your research harm anyone? And if it does, they usually say no. Or if there's a risk of harming people, you're gonna have to explain what you're gonna do in your study to mitigate that harm or explain the risk. And then, once that's approved and you go out and do your research, that takes time, right? Whether you're doing panels, whether you're collecting data, that takes time to collect that, to review that, to analyze that, and then form results from that. And then, once you do that and you actually produce a paper, then, at least how I was taught was, you go to the conference circuit. You're going to academic conferences where other scholars from other institutions in other parts of the world can hear you present and provide you feedback. And so after you do the conference circuit, you've gotten the feedback, then you prepare a final version to submit for publication. And just because you submit it for publication doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be accepted. You may have to submit it multiple times to different publications. When you submit it for publication, what you're looking for is what we call peer review. And we'll see next week when we dive into looking into research articles, we're looking for peer-reviewed research articles. What that means is, when I submit my article, there's going to be a panel of at least 3 people, maybe 4 or 5, that read that, provide feedback on that, and send that to me and say, all right, here's some changes you need to make, here's some questions we need answered in order to publish this research. And you can choose, all right, I'm going to do those updates, I'm going to provide those answers, and move on and see if they'll accept it, or move on to a different publication. So you may go through that. That may take some time to go through that process of submitting it to journals, having it peer reviewed, getting that feedback, and then either submitting what they want in order to publish it or moving on to a different journal. So that's kind of the process, so you understand. So that is what we mean by peer review. Is it has been reviewed by scholars and experts. I've been a peer reviewer for a couple different journals, mostly related to communication and leadership, and it's fun. Once you reach a certain level, usually you have to have a master's degree in order to be invited to be on a journal a panel, and I get sent articles to review and provide feedback on, and to recommend for publication or to deny publication. And so it's fun because you get to see the research that people are currently doing. So I share all of that to share that keep in mind, research changes, research is updated, so we want to keep in mind when it's published and that publication date, and that publication date is when it was printed, but it's been years of research usually in the making even to get to that point of being published. Yes?
Do you think that with like technology advancing in the exponential way that it is, do you think that it has like minimized people's interest in like speech and overall like the communication world? Like, have you seen a shift as technology has advanced with like the amount of people that are actually getting these degrees and having like this interest in the communication world?
I think I've seen an opposite. I've seen an increase of people because the technology has made it more complicated. We're seeing an increase of people wanting to do research in how complicated it's getting, right? So as like artificial intelligence continues to grow and impact our communications, there are scholars who are studying that impact and trying to predict what are the next changes that are going to happen. So I think more people, at least in the communication world, because at least communication studies, we have kind of the two sides where we're studying communications, so that's going to be journalism, all the messages that we're sending out, and then we have communication studies where we're studying the language that we use, how we are communicating with people or within organizations. So not necessarily communications, but the process of like the communication model that we saw, right? The speaker, the context, like people are studying all of that. So I think as technology has grown, it's become more complicated, and people are wanting to study it more to figure out, how is this impacting how we communicate? How is this impacting us for the future? So, yeah.
Very refreshing. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So, what is some ways you can collect data for your speech? And this will kind of be where we wrap up. So, one is you could do interviews. In fact, does anyone here? I thought I heard Jaquise, you work in HR. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Anyone else here work in HR? Okay. See me after class, if you don't mind, just real quick. I have to do interviews of people who work in HR for a class assignment. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask and see if I can talk to you for a little bit at some point. Because that is a very common way to collect information and data. Very simple, right? The stages of the interview process. Before you do an interview, write the interview questions. During the interview, ask if you can record it, right? Ask for their consent so that you can transcribe it, right? So you can type up what they say so you get what they say accurate. And then after it, make sure you provide a thank you, right? For them spending that time going through the interview. So, depending on your subject, you may want to interview someone and use those quotes in your speech. Use personal experience, right? Use the experience you have, the knowledge you have to include that as supporting points. Some research tips I have: start early, right? Start now identifying your subject. Take research notes. Every step of the process as you are reading something new, make notes on what you're reading. Make notes on what stands out to you. Make notes of page numbers, of quotes or things that you could quote in your speech. And then create a preliminary bibliography. Starting now, all the resources that you read, if whatever stands out to you, pull the APA citation for that and put that in a Word document and save it so that you can go back to it. I can't tell you the number of times I haven't done this, and at some point I'll be like, oh man, I remember this source, or I remember this quote, but I don't remember the source. And so then I'm having to backtrack and find where I read that. And then when we pick up on Tuesday of next week, I'm gonna talk about 3 types of supporting materials that I'll be looking for you to use: examples, statistics, and testimony. And then I'll show you, like I said, we'll do a little activity where I'll show you where to go on the website to pull some of this information. So that'll be what we do on Tuesday. Before the end of this week, we also have the Civic Engagement News assignment. So I will post on Brightspace. I will post this, and I'll also move the deadline. Right? So deadline won't be till next week. But I will post this script. So before now and Tuesday, you can change any of this that you want. But this will be even shorter than the classmate introduction speeches. We're literally going through this and inserting a quote from a story you have found in the news about someone or an organization being civically responsible or civically engaged. So on Tuesday, this will be where we start. Is everyone going around essentially reading this script, inserting according to whatever source they have. So we're going to practice inserting a source, like I had talked about, I guess it was last week, right? Using the phrase according to, and including the author, the date, and doing that in-text citation. For an example, you can look at my Civic Engagement News practice speech example that's on Brightspace, and you'll see where I put according to npr.org. That's what we're practicing right here. Yeah, question?
So I just wanted to confirm what we have for the end of the week. So I know we have the chapter quizzes,
Mhm.
which is a constant, but the civic engagement is going to move to next week. And the informative speech topic is still due on Sunday.
Correct. And the informative speech topic is just this preparation stage. So this is what you are doing and posting as a discussion post. And the reason you post it as a discussion post is because you all need to see, whoever posts before you, we don't want a duplicate speech. It can be the same subject, but you can't have the same exact pack. And so everything should be different. So it's topics or subjects are claimed in the order that you post this. So again, it can be the same subject, just can't be the same subject plus the same method, type, and organizational pattern. So make those choices and post that on Brightspace. And again, this can change, so you're not stuck to it. But this gives you a starting point as we start talking about doing research next week. Yes?
Would you mind, on Brightspace posting just like the updated information of what we're supposed to be submitting, just because I have terrible memory, I don't know about you guys,
Sure.
but.
Yeah, yep, I can do that. So yeah, this is the deliverable for this week. The objective for this week is this right here.
And
Yeah.
stopping at introduction, right?
You can stop at central, you can stop at, you don't have to have a central idea necessarily, just from here up. And that's what I'll post on Brightspace.
Okay.
Yes.
Oh, no, you were just asking my question.
Oh, okay,
The
yes.
civic engagement, like the instructions online say to do the informative speech out loud, do we still need to do that?
No, we're doing a simplified version. That's a
Okay.
full version that people online are doing. We're doing a simple practice speech version. Yeah, so you don't have to do the full.
Okay. If I did, is there a way for me to flip my civic engagement to be the informative? Like,
Of course, yes. That's a great question. Your civic engagement news practice speech is a practice speech. So if you want to use that as a foundation for your informative speech, go for it.
Okay, because
Yeah.
I went all in on my.
Yeah. Great job. That's great and great practice. That's going to help you.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, let's take a look. All right, thank you all. Appreciate it. Have a great weekend. Be safe in the weather.